What's up everybody, it's Grant bringing you guys a new video, and today we're going to be talking about why it is not Conor McGregor's fault that his team is, well, I don't know if you can technically say doing so poorly, but I guess you could say their record is pretty poor, obviously, on The Ultimate Fighter. If you guys are watching it, then you know that they have yet to win one fight, and there's only one fight left, which is actually coming up this upcoming week. So I'm going to be telling you guys my opinion on why it is not his fault whatsoever, and it's really honestly not even the fighters themselves their fault either. So I'm going to go through and explain why I think that's the case. You guys let me know what you think, give your opinions down below. I actually initially thought of this because I saw a tweet which pointed out why the whole idea of The Ultimate Fighter being veterans versus prospects is a really bad idea. I guess, you know, in concept form, it's like a cool idea to do that, but I'm going to show you guys why it kind of doesn't really make sense in terms of the actual matchups for the fights themselves. So essentially, I'm going to pull up the SureDog records of all of the fighters when they're going up against each other, and I'm going to show you guys why it doesn't really make sense for them to be fighting each other. So the first fight was Nate versus Roosevelt Roberts, and the record for Nate was 16-5, which is obviously a pretty good record, and it's a little bit deceiving, but I'm going to kind of go into it. So his record was 16-5, and Roberts' record is 12-3. So technically you could say that the better record is Nate just because he has more wins, despite the fact that he has, you know, that extra 2 losses compared to Roberts, but he does have more wins than he has more losses than Roberts, if that makes sense. That's a bad way of explaining it, but you get the point. So if you scroll down on Nate's SureDog, or just his record in general, you know, he doesn't really have that much experience in super well-known name promotions. Of course, you know, he has LFA, he also has PFL, which obviously are, you know, closer to being more well-named, but obviously no UFC experience, no, you know, you could even say no Bellator experience, no ONE experience, so no, I guess you could say those are like the top 3 promotions. He doesn't have experience in any of those promotions. Now, if you go over to Roberts, obviously he's the veteran in this situation, and he does have UFC experience. And not only does he have UFC experience, he has multiple UFC wins. So he's also fought in Bellator as well, which I mentioned Nate has not fought in Bellator. He's won a fight in Bellator. He won a Tuesday night contender series, Dana White's contender series, went to the UFC and won 2 fights back-to-back, a loss in the UFC, another 2 wins in the UFC, a loss in the UFC to Jim Miller, and then also a no contest in the UFC, and then another loss. So yeah, sure, he does have some losses in the UFC, but this guy has multiple wins in the UFC compared to Nate, who has no even fights at all in, again, you could say the top 3 promotions. So this is kind of going to be the consistent thing that I'm going to bring up when we go through these fights. Obviously, you know, the records can kind of give you a little bit of skewed data because you look at the record and say, okay, this guy has a better record, but you actually have to look into the fights and see which promotions they're fighting on and who they're fighting. Like, you know, a loss in the UFC to Jim Miller is not something to really be upset about because obviously Jim Miller is very, very good, you know, has a ton of experience, been around the UFC for a long time. So again, this is kind of going to be the consistent theme as we go through it. So the next fight we have is Trevor Wells, who is part of the Prospects, 8-3, and Timur Valiev, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, hopefully, is 18-3. So obviously a massive increase, even let alone in terms of just record. He has 10 more wins than Trevor Wells has, so 10 more fights in total, and all of those fights being wins. Now we look at Trevor Wells, of course, 8-3 again is a good record, but when you look at it, again, no experience in those top 3 promotions. He does have some experience in LFA. He was on Uriah Faber's A1 Combat, but again, just no fights in those top 3, let alone, again, in most of the case of the veterans, they have wins in these top 3 promotions. So if we go over to Timur Valiev, he has that UFC experience, and again, similar to how Roberts did, he has multiple wins in the UFC. So he came into the UFC, no contest, he had 2 wins in the UFC, and then a loss in his last professional fight in the UFC. So he's got more wins in the UFC than he has losses. So he has fought in that top 3. He also fought in PFL, but he has wins in at least one of those top 3 promotions as of right now, which means he has more experience. So not only in this case is it more experience in terms of 10 more fights and 10 more wins in total, he also has wins in promotions that are, you know, known to be significantly better. And next up we have McKenzie versus Hubbard. McKenzie's record is 11-2, 1 draw, so obviously a good record. Hubbard 15-6. So I mean, it's kind of difficult to say which fighter has the better record just because Aaron McKenzie has such a low amount of losses. But again, looking through it, Aaron McKenzie, he has fought in Bellator, but he is 1-1 in Bellator. I believe that is correct. So he does have 2 fights experience in, again, at least in my opinion, one of the top 3 fighting promotions in MMA right now. And then he has 4 fights, I believe, in LFA, all wins. So a little bit better of experience in comparison to a lot of the prospects that were in this tournament. If you flip over to Austin Hubbard, he does have that UFC experience again, and again, just as we talked about with the other fighters, multiple wins in the UFC. So he came into the UFC, he lost his first fight in the UFC, I believe, and then had a win, he had a loss, he had a win, he had a loss, he had a win, he had a loss. So again, another situation where multiple wins in, I guess you could say, obviously, you know, UFC, I guess, is highly regarded as the top promotion in MMA. So he has multiple wins in the top promotion compared to a guy who has less fights and only has 1 win in one of the top 3 promotions, that being Bellator, and has also lost in Bellator as well. Then next up, we have Mando Gutierrez, I believe is pronounced correctly, and Cody Gibson. So Mando's record is 8-2, good record, compared to Cody's record of 19-8. So again, another situation of significantly a lot more experience. You could technically argue that 8-2 is, you know, a better ratio than 19-8, but again, the experience is definitely there for Cody Gibson. If you scroll down on Mando, he has some experience again in LFA. This is a common theme for some of the prospects, having LFA experience, but then has 1 fight in Dana White's Contender Series in which he lost by unanimous decision. So again, you know, I said it was going to be a common theme, and it has been. No experience in the top 3 promotions. And then we move over to Cody Gibson. Again, another situation where he actually doesn't have multiple wins in the UFC, but he does have a win in the UFC. His first fight in the UFC, I believe, was against Aljamain Sterling. Again, not somebody to be ashamed of, you know, losing to, despite the fact it was in 2014, it still was Aljamain Sterling. And then he has a knockout win in the UFC, and 2 more fights after that in the UFC. So again, a win in one of the top 3 promotions, this being likely, obviously, UFC, the top promotion right now for MMA. So more fights, significantly more fights, more wins, and more experience in those top 3 promotions. And then next up, we have Carlos Vera and Brad Katona. Obviously, Brad Katona, former, you know, he won the Ultimate Fighter formerly, so this, right off the start of it, is, I guess, not necessarily fair. You know, there's always, of course, you know, a puncher's chance. Somebody can win, somebody can be better, but the odds are stacked against them. So Carlos Vera has a record of 11-3. Again, looking through his record, the most notable promotion is LFA. I guess you could kind of say Fury as well, as, I guess, decently well known. A good record. Again, same thing as I've been saying basically this whole video, no fights in the top 3 promotions, let alone wins in any of the top 3 promotions. And then you compare it to Brad Katona, who is 12-2, which of course right away is a better record, and he has experience in the UFC, obviously. Again, as I mentioned, he won the Ultimate Fighter, had another win in the UFC, a loss, and then he was out of the UFC and over to Brave. But again, experience in the UFC, arguably the top MMA promotion right now, and has already won the show. So again, quite a mismatch in this situation. All right, so this one kind of throws a curveball into what I'm saying, but I'll go into it a little bit. So this one was Lee Hammond versus Kurt Holobaugh. Lee Hammond, 5-0, you know, one of McGregor's proteges who's supposed to be super good, and obviously is already doing very well if you have a record of 5-0, compared to Kurt Holobaugh's record of 19-7. So obviously a significantly higher amount of fights for Kurt Holobaugh, a lot more time in the ring in general. But let's look through the records. So Lee Hammond has experience in Bellator. He has 1 win in Bellator, and that was a knockout by punches, and that was only in 2022. So that was fairly recent experience, again, in one of the top 3 promotions in MMA. But again, only 5 fights. Now, obviously he's won all 5 of those fights, but again, it's difficult because you can be super good, but a lot of times experience will just beat out talent, because if you've fought so many times, you're just going to know what to do. Now, this fight specifically, Lee Hammond was arguably, or at least in my opinion, winning the fight by a good amount, before getting choked out close to the end of the fight. So in my opinion, he was winning that fight, would have won that fight. But again, this is kind of the curveball in the situation. But if we look at Kurt Holobaugh, he does have experience again in the UFC. I don't believe he has any wins in the UFC. He got a no contest on Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series, had a loss in his first and second UFC fight. and third actually UFC fight as well, and then was cut from the UFC. So this is a situation in which he doesn't have wins in one of the top 3 promotions, unless I'm missing something here, but he does have multiple fights in the UFC, a lot more fighting experience, and I guess this is the one situation where one of the veterans doesn't have a win in one of the top 3 promotions, obviously including the UFC, and in this situation, he was losing the fight until the end of it. So this kind of breaks apart from, what I've been talking about through each of these fights. All right, and moving on to the most recent episode, as of the time that I'm recording this video, we had Landon Quinones 7-1 versus, of course, Jason Knight 23-7. Right off the bat, a lot more fight experience for Jason Knight, multiple promotions, multiple sports, because he's also fought, bare knuckle boxing, I believe it was. So lots and lots more experience. If we look at Landon Quinones' record, the most notable fight was actually in Bellator. This was back in 2017 and was a draw. So does have some of that top 3 MMA promotion experience, but it was a draw. Wasn't too long back, but since then he's fought in Titan, which of course isn't part of that top 3. So again, the record is good, 7-1. But only has that one fight in one of the top 3 promotions, and again was a draw. Now, of course, switching over to Jason Knight, I'm sure everybody already knows all about this. I don't really need to go through it, but multiple wins in the UFC. The Ultimate Fighter finale was a loss, but then he went on to the UFC to win 4 fights in a row. Lost 4 after that, and then I believe that's when he was cut from the UFC. But a ton of UFC experience, a ton of top 3 MMA promotion experience, and 4 wins in a row in the UFC. So, and that's also including fighting people like Dan Hooker and beating Dan Hooker. Yes, it was 2016, but still having that experience and beating people like that, you're going to have obviously a lot more experience than someone who is 7-1. Again, yes, a very good record, but does not have that top 3 experience, minus 1 fight in Bellator, which was a draw. Now, let's move on and kind of have a little bit of a prediction for the last fight. And, obviously the odds are going to be significantly in the veterans team, or in the veteran team's favor, because they have not lost a fight yet. And, before even looking at the records, I'm going to assume that what I've been talking about this entire video is going to be, again, repeated in this last fight as well, especially because Hunter Azure was a first pick, I believe. So let's take a look at these guys. So first off, we have Rico, again, 11-2, 1 no contest, very good record. But scrolling down, let's take a look. He has Bellator experience. A few fights. He's got 3 fights, I believe, in Bellator. The first one was a win, second one was a no contest, and the third was a win. Went on to Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series and lost on that. He fought in Bellator back in, his first fight was 2013, and then fought again in 2014, and then another one in 2014. So it's been a really long time since he has fought in Bellator. So yes, he does have that top 3 MMA promotion experience, but it's been a really long time. And then when he kind of jumped up to, I guess you could consider Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series close to a top 3 promotion, he lost when he jumped up to that. Obviously, it's not exactly the UFC, but it's for people who are trying to get into the UFC. So, the experience level is probably there for a lot of guys, and it's going to be obviously super difficult because everybody is gunning for a spot in the UFC. So a decent amount of experience again in that top 3 promotion area, but a long time ago. That's 10 years ago for his first fight, and then 9 years ago, I believe, for the second and third fight. So it has been quite a while. Now on the other side for the veterans, we've got Hunter Azure. He is 10-3, so he actually has the same amount of fights as Rico, and technically his record isn't as good. But again, let's take a look at where he fought. In 2019, he fought on Dana White's Contender Series with a win. He's beat Brad Katona, who is obviously, as we just recently talked about, he's in this competition as well and has won the Ultimate Fighter before. So he beat Brad Katona, lost his next fight in the UFC, won his next fight in the UFC, and then lost his next one. So again, guys, same situation as we've been talking about with basically all the other fights, with the exception of, the Lee Hammond fight and technically one of the other fights, but it kind of has stayed consistent with what I've been saying. So this one, again, is consistent. So obviously my prediction is going to go with the veterans because he has that UFC experience. He has multiple wins in the UFC. He's won a fight on Dana White's Contender Series, compared to somebody who technically has a better record than him, but hasn't fought in the top 3 MMA promotions, technically, again, if you include the Contender Series, since 2018, which he lost. because obviously Bellator, again, has been 9 or 10 years ago, depending on which fight you're talking about. So guys, to all sum it up, this is why I say that it's not Conor McGregor's fault that his team does not have a win yet in the competition, and there's only one fight left. The whole idea of veterans versus prospects, while it's kind of a cool idea, it's, obviously now proven to not really work that well, because experience is something that's very, very important in any sport, but especially in martial arts, because the knowledge of fighting is something that's super important when you get in the cage, and that's something that's been proven. This is kind of like a theory that has been proven throughout this show. So in my opinion, this is probably going to be a clean sweep for Team Chandler, just because, again, it is those veterans versus prospects, and it could be completely flipped around if it was the other way. Now, a lot of people, on Twitter have been complaining, saying, oh, McGregor doesn't show up for the weigh-ins, he doesn't, people claim that he's not a good coach. I don't think that that's the case at all. He's been coaching for a very, very long time. I believe he was coaching boxing at SBG in Ireland when he was super young. He has that experience. He's a super knowledgeable fighter, and people have said that about him for a while. So, it's not me just, as a Conor McGregor fan saying this. I'm going through and showing you guys this is likely why the veterans are beating the prospects. And that doesn't mean that the prospects aren't going to be good. They just probably need more experience to be able to compete against these guys who have been there and have done it and are trying to get back to it as well. They know how to fight in the UFC. They have the experience of fighting in the UFC, or again, in Bellator and stuff like that. Well, all the veterans obviously have competed in the UFC, but they have so much more experience than the prospects, and that's something that's really, really, not helping the prospects throughout this entire show. So guys, that's going to bring us to the end of the video. Let me know what you think. Am I off base by, looking through these and showing how the experience isn't even remotely close in most of them? Let me know what you guys think. Let me know who you think is going to win the next fight, which again is coming up, I believe, this Tuesday. Do you think Hunter is going to win? Do you think it's going to be a clean sweep? Do you agree with me that the whole idea of veterans versus prospects is not the greatest because it gives a massive edge to the veterans? Or do you think that Chandler's just that good of a coach? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.